Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 9 of the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. If this is your first time viewing, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4AS, and welcome to my co-host, Mr. E. So, Mr. E, how are you going today?
I am well, 4IS. How are you?
Yeah, I'm going pretty good. So I thought for today's episode, we've both done, videos on the middle class and the proletariat. So the differences between middle and working class. Is there a difference between middle class and the working class? And basically talking about that sort of nuance. So I thought it would be a great subject to talk about today.
Yes. Look, I think it is important in the sense that if you're going to get into the debate about classes and you're going to engage with people on this notion, I think it's fundamental to the understanding of how society works that you dispel some massive, massive myths out there about how class-based societies work. Like the obvious reaction that most people have when you say that society is broken into classes today is that, oh, no, that can't be true. Like, we don't live in societies that have formal class structures, like, an aristocratic class or nobility, and then you have a bunch of commoners and the mass of the population that have no rights and things like that. We don't live in a class society. But then when you drill down to how they would describe themselves, people would put themselves into the two categories that we've got named for this topic today. They would either describe themselves as middle class or working class. And I guess the two like massive myths that you want to dispel in any type of discussion about class is the idea that one, class does not exist. There is class out there. It might not be as overt as it has been previously in history and previous to the modernizing of the world, the liberalization of the world, but it does exist. And the other massive myth is that class is broken down into various different factions or different segments, if you will. In my opinion, there really is only two classes that exist. And I think that's exactly what we're going to try and explore today.
Yes, and I think probably one thing that we should talk about today as well is the misconceptions that happen when people use the heuristics of, oh, well, I must be middle class, because I kind of feel like with middle class, people just assume that they are so, as long as they're kind of well off. And what I mean by well off is, they kind of have a roof over their heads. They've got some disposable income. They're not really working from paycheck to paycheck. And yeah, like very much an emphasis of the fact that, they can go out for a nice meal or that sort of thing. And the reason why I've got there the principles of communism, it might be what you were kind of referring to before, is that Engels, who wrote this book, and it's actually the first draft of the Communist Manifesto that he ends up writing with Karl Marx, is he goes massively into the history of the working class and basically the transition from the artisan period of history for the worker to the transition to the proletariat, which was, which eventuated out of the Industrial Revolution. And for those of you who don't know, the proletariat is basically that working class, that basically the factory worker that came to prominence in the Industrial Revolution. And Engels talks in the history a massive part about in the artisan period. So these were the merchants, these were the craftsmen that worked with their tools. That the difference between the proletariat and the artisan was the artisan, hey, got a bunch of clay, got a piece of stone, and worked with their tools, worked on that piece of stone from start to finish. So while it took time, they had the skills necessary to kind of work with that piece of clay or piece of stone. And they basically, if you commission them to create that artwork or that sort of thing, that one person basically had to work on it and they had to be there from the start to the finish.
Yeah.
But with the proletariat is, well, basically like a cog in the machine, because everything became far more efficient with this sort of capitalism. You could give little pieces of the job to the various workers, and um, you didn't need that sort of artisan way of doing things. You could basically give a piece of the work off to all of the workers in the factory, and they worked on those commodities really efficiently. And that was basically the difference between the previous period, which was the artisan period, to the proletariat. And he actually uses this kind of argument to reinforce of, well, that's the reason why you get this sort of antagonism with capitalism of, are you basically part of the proletariat where you're kind of working on your commodities in the factory, and or are you the capitalists who basically put in the capital in order to run that factory, but you're actually exploiting the worker? He and it's basically that conversation about the antagonism and basically class consciousness.
Right. So like the artisan, like if we go back then, they kind of had control over the process, and they got a product or they got their materials and their tools, and they oversee almost the entire process of that commodity production. They they have all the skill set that takes them from the beginning of that commodity production to the actual end result almost. And they not just have the skill set, but they have all the tools as well, and they kind of own those tools. And in owning, I guess, the skills and the tools in order to create, they have a lot more autonomy in the process. Like you even mentioned that they would have been commissioned mostly to do these works. So they are actually working in a sense for themselves. And so like they have the ownership of the process, and they have the ownership of themselves, in which they command themselves to do their own work. But then when you have the kind of early manufacturing that takes over from the artisan kind of style of work, manufacturing is kind of this system that relies on what you were talking about before, the division of labor. So you have the artisan that sculpts the rock, then paints it and makes it into a finished product. All these sort of things. If the artisan does 4 parts in the process, in manufacture, you start to have 4 different people at each part of that process in charge of different things. And at that point, they might not even own or control. They'll have the skills to do each of those certain tasks, but they might not own those tools anymore, or have control over those means of producing. And they start to lose that autonomy. They have more a refined and specific skill set that pigeonholes them into a certain industry, and they can't get out of it. And then they don't really have the ownership of what they're working with anymore. That's controlled by whoever is running that manufacturing agency. So at that point, you have this kind of development of the proletariat. Now, the defining factor, I think, in the proletariat or the working class, these words can be used interchangeably, is the fact that they sell their labor as a commodity for a price.
Mm.
And so that is one of the defining characteristics of the proletariat. It's not working on commission. It's not using your skill set to help produce something and having kind of ownership of that process. There is a fundamental or inherent characteristic of the proletariat, which is that, yes, you sell your work for a price, for a set time, for a set output to somebody else, so they can take the value that you create, expropriate, appropriate it, however you want to call it, and use that for their own needs, wants, and desires. And usually that would be sold to a capitalist. As you said, somebody who has capital upfront, usually upfront in the money form, and then throws that capital into circulation, and they buy commodities, like physical commodities like raw materials or products, and labor, and combine those two things in their factory or their manufacturing house to then turn that into a product, and then again get that product returned for additional capital, additional money. And so that is the point at which you start to get the working class.
Mm.
You have people that exist primarily, and society is structured primarily, or starting to be structured, around this massive working population that sells their labor time for a price.
Yes, and I think this is what's the very interesting point about the principles of communism, is that it's kind of the focus on, you have the artisan and you have the proletariat. And with the artisan, what's interesting about it is there is the control and the control over the product. But what happens with the transition with the Industrial Revolution to the proletariat is the swapping out of the control in terms of the worker for efficiency. And the unfortunate byproduct of basically making the proletariat a cog in the machine is the thing about that machine is, as soon as you have a bad cog, throw it out, put it back in. It's just within the structure to kind of be exploitative. Because if you have somebody that's working in that little station, being, only controlling a certain part of it, compared to an artisan, which they have such great skill that if they're working on a masterpiece and for whatever reason their patron is unhappy with them, effectively, if they were to go on strike on that and be like, oh, hey, you can't have this masterpiece without me finishing it, mate, the patron can't do anything about that. But if, for example, you had a rowdy worker that was the head of your head of the union at work that you didn't like too much, you could come up with a very bad excuse to fire them. But if it's legitimate within the contract, then you could potentially get rid of them, and there's not really many people can do about it.
Yes.
And this kind of ties into what I go into in my video essay about the jungle, because Upton Sinclair was a socialist around the early 1900s, and he was known as a muckraker. And these were guys that were novelists, but they did a lot of journalism, and basically they used they're a bit like a jester in a court in the sense of they use fiction to tell the truth. So while they did a whole bunch of journalism, they used their novels to expose truth about what was happening in like society at the time. And the thing about The Jungle is it was discussing about the packing houses and basically about what Karl Marx talks about with, you know, the reserve army of the working class and how somebody accident that happens in the packing houses and there was always somebody to fill that space. Like people were just incredibly disposable and everything. And I want to tie this to the idea of the middle class, and there seems to be this kind of focus when you do talk about the middle class about their disposable income, that it's actually income, like it's basically a middle class person is tied to their pay packet, and that's kind of it. Like if you're well off, you're middle class. But if you actually analyze our society, like think of a common misconception about somebody who's a working class. Like you'd probably think that they were a tradie, that they went to the pub on a Friday night, or that sort of thing. I don't know about you, but I know of pretty well off tradie people that actually earn quite a considerable sum of money. And what's interesting about The Jungle is that there are actually very, very much sections dedicated to it. Like these were very much working class people. But Yorgos, who's the protagonist in this, there's like a very specific chapter set up where he talks to the person like basically the real estate agent that he buys the house from. And the real estate agent tells him all about the mortgage that he has to pay, the installments that he has to pay, the insurance on the house that he has to pay, all the amenities that the government forces him to pay because that's part of being part of the town. And this all sounds like stuff that like ordinary people nowadays would worry about. They would worry about the various insurances that they would have to pay. They'd have to worry about the water tax, the electricity bills that they have to pay, just to kind of stay afloat. So it seems less about what's in your pay packet and more about are you working for someone in order to subsist in society, in order to exist in society, or are you a big multinational company and you're exploiting your workers? Like, are you a capitalist or are you a worker, basically?
Right. I think there's a good lesson to be learned from the facade of the idea of the middle class. Like as you said, it's built on a very flimsy pretext. The traditional, I guess, or 20th century way of looking at the middle class would have been something like middle class people would be white collar workers, and your working class people would be your blue collar workers. So, like as you said before, that example of you'd have the working class people would be tradies, or people that work in factories. Jobs that don't require some type of university education, let's say. They don't sit you in an office all day long. They have you working physically more strenuously than you would be working mentally. Not to say that people in the trades or in the factories won't be using any of their mental faculties. That I'm not saying that. But the connotation is there that, yes, you have your office types versus your labouring types. And that would distinguish traditionally where you get your middle class and where you get your lower class. But as you said, the ironic thing is that especially nowadays, you do have tradies that are on exorbitant incomes and would put most office working and white collar persons with degrees to shame. They might triple the average income of an office worker. And so the question then is, okay, if it's not, I guess, defined by your occupation, then if it's defined by your pay packet, then you have to be earning over six figures to be middle class. Then the idea of having it gauged off your occupation or off your pay packet loses all relevance because it's constantly changing with whatever the characteristics are of what people get paid or of the, I guess, the rank of different professions at any given point in time. And if that is the measure, something that is completely subjective, then it just changes with any variable that's added into the mix, then where does the idea of the working class come from? And what is it grounded in? And it is grounded, I would say, in nothing. The idea of the middle class, for me, is a tool of propaganda. It is to muddy the waters between the only two classes that exist, which is, let's say crudely, the lower class and the upper class, or the working class and the ruling class. And it muddies it quite well in the sense that if you asked anyone, I would not, yeah, a majority of people would tell you that they're middle class. Whether that be based on their occupation, it would be based on their actual income, or based on their aspirations. Most people would identify as being middle class. They wouldn't call themselves in the top 1% of society, but they definitely wouldn't want to associate with being called working class, which has a very negative connotation built into it because it kind of resonates with being either poor or uneducated or at the lowest rung of society. And that is the propaganda of the middle class. It's like that idea in marketing where you have, like when you go to the movies, the reason why you have, a small drink and a large drink and a medium drink is because the medium drink is there to kind of push people to making a decision to upgrade or something like that. Having a middle class is a marketing tool to make people feel like they are entitled to more, and so they will consume better and be better consumers in society. Because if you are aspirationally middle class, which I think most people would define themselves as, then you are going to want to keep up with the Joneses a little bit more. You're going to want to consume better. You're going to want to be, which in a capitalist society is everything. If your whole economy is built around commodity production, you need people that are really ready just to consume everything that's thrown at them. And so the middle class really, I think in the very, very modern and contemporary sense, as it's been used under neoliberalism, is basically this device which convinces people that everyone is kind of together in this like large middle. And it's really only at the extreme ends that you have, really dirty poverty that you don't really want to talk about and associate with. And obscene rich, but that's just a handful of people. And it's negligible. Don't worry about those richies. Most people sit in the healthy and balanced middle. And that's where we all get along and survive. And I think, that is an incredibly deceptive idea and notion, which completely destroys class consciousness and destroys the idea of that thing that we were talking about before, the proletariat. Because that is one of the most important parts about the proletariat. As they were developing and they were losing their autonomy, and they were really put up against during the Industrial Revolution, juxtaposed quite heavily against their, capitalist overlords. The proletariat started to become very class conscious. And when you become class conscious and there is struggle and antagonism, you start to organize and you start fighting back.
Mm.
And you don't have people fighting back when they think that they're comfortably middle class.
You actually raised a really good point that I actually didn't think about before, which middle class is very much linked to the idea of consumerism in um, in capitalism. And it's actually a really good point because it's got me thinking. It's only once you see yourself as middle class and that you have that disposable income that you start thinking about the idea of investments. And when I say that, I mean, you got disposable incomes. Oh, let's buy some shares into this really big company because I might be able to make myself some extra dollars, some extra capital. Oh, I know a house should fundamentally be a right for a human being, but now that I've actually got some capital and I've got some disposable income, maybe I might buy an investment property that I can get somebody to pay their rent to me and I can gain some more capital. It's, it's, I guess, cynically, you could look at the middle class as being a mini capitalist, a somebody that keeps the economy ticking because it convinces them to buy into the idea of capitalism that if they invest into this system, they can gain more capital and they could just have a little peek into what the big companies earn. And if you do things exactly the same as us, you might have a chance of being exactly like us and having all the flashy, um, nice things like we do.
The aspiration, that's it right there. This is like a taste of how the other half live. And all that sort of, dangling the carrot in front of the consumer to get them to spend more and all that sort of stuff. Like you said, investing in this kind of lifestyle, playing at it, but never really taking it and making it come to fruition. Because the thing that defines the two classes, if we reduce it down to its basic elements, that, like you expressed before, you either make a living by being paid a wage, you survive off that wage, or you survive off your investments completely. And you can have people that consider themselves middle class because they dabble in investments and stuff like that. They're savvy, they have a few shares, they like have an investment property, or, they bought some gold or bought into some silver or something like that. They're just going to wait for their little market kind of miracle to happen and they're just going to make it big. But like primarily these people are working and they're surviving off a salary. They're surviving off an income of some sort, which is paid in compensation for their labor and for their work, for their effort, their skill. And so, you can call it middle class, you can call it aspirational capitalists, you can call it petty bourgeois. You can name it whatever you want in that sense, but primarily if you work to survive, you are part of the working class. And okay, there's a technicality, and someone pointed this out to me. They said, well, I'm a pensioner or I'm on welfare. Does that make me not working class? Because I don't actually live off my labor. Now, that is a very good technicality, but it is a technicality nonetheless. Because yes, okay, there's a social safety net nowadays that didn't exist before. And so, yes, we have civilized ourselves to the point where we think it should be, it is reasonable to protect people that are unable to find work or are unable to engage in the wage work system that a majority of us have to live under. But like, I'll tell you this, most welfare payments are means tested, and they wouldn't be handing it out to people that have investment properties and have control of massive dividends from their shares and their portfolios. So unless you are living off your investments, if you're taking a handout from a state machine or a government of some sort. No, you're not in the capitalist class, and you're not a rentier living off, the rent that you take from being a landlord or owning something that you provide to the working class. No, you are part of the working class because you are affected by the subsistence that you gain from the system. And so I would put you in the working class as well. And so, yes, I really think it comes down to the fact that there has been such a muddled conversation surrounding this ever since, I would say, after World War II and after the Cold War and then the onslaught the rise of neoliberalism. There has been a complete degrading of the idea that there is an upper class and a working class, and then the confusion of adding in this notion of this middle class that a majority of people comfortably exist in. It's a farcical idea, and it's a weapon of class warfare designed to confuse the masses. And it works great. It works wonderfully.
Well, it's kind of the thing in education where the idea of the bell curve that like everyone's kind of near the middle, and as you kind of say, it's a divisive tool because, well, actually, it's a complacent tool because if a majority of people are middle class, if they have a disposable income where they can live comfortably, if you kind of put people in that kind of complacent mindset, then they don't really question anything because they don't have a reason to question things, which is completely opposite to a revolution. Because obviously, in a revolution, you do have the masses that are questioning things. So if you can, if you are a successful marketer for a capitalist, if you can convince everyone to be complacent or at least say, yeah, you have enough. Why do you have to worry about things? They are less likely to question things and to follow your system.
That's right. Yeah, agreed. And like they're easier as well if they're practice and aspirational consumers. They're easy, or they're more prone to taking on debt. And so if they do have a disposable income or a large enough income, they will lock themselves into debt peonage or servitude, which, if we're going to go along this vein of not questioning the system, if most people are aspirationally middle class and they want to own a home and have a nice car and all these things that do add up, they can take loans out, they can get mortgages, which locks them into that cycle of having to make regular payments and having to find regular work. Again, unless they're living off some type of well-structured investment and portfolio, then they are finding work and regularly enough to pay back their debts. And so, yeah, the middle class and having these desires that's built into that class it's an incredible tool. Not only does it trap people into like this certain lifestyle that's debt driven and consumer driven, but it also completely destroys, like you're saying, their class consciousness. They have no desire after that, or after being classed in that middle portion, for any type of revolutionary or class struggle needs or wants or dreams. They don't care about that stuff. They're comfortable because they think they're part of a comfortable majority, and they just take it in their stride. Even when like there's such an understanding and like there's constant discussion out there about how the whole system pins on this middle class, and like how a healthy middle class is the thing that promotes, that's like the earmark or the defining point in any healthy society or healthy, healthy, uh, healthy society or healthy system is having a healthy middle class. People talk
Mm.
about that a lot because if you have these people there driving the economy and driving spending and stuff like that, um, they're the ones that really make a difference.
Yeah.
They're the ones that are out there, like I said, spending and making the economy turn over time and time again. But it's just, I think, it's just a misconception. It's just a deceptive tool in order to get people spending because that's what the current capitalist type of economic situation that we have requires. It requires people to keep on spending, whether they have that money or not, through credit or what have you,
Mm.
in order for the whole system not to topple over and come crashing down.
I might end this podcast on a bit of a story that
Mm.
I have, and it's a story about the recent federal election here that they had in Australia. And I'm sure everyone here in Australia knows of all of the big yellow signs from that very conservative party here in Australia, the United Australia Party. And I remember riding in my car down the main road here in Sydney, the like Parramatta Road, and plastered everywhere around when the election happened. The posters kept on emphasizing, oh, capping interest rates at 3%. We'll make sure of that. We'll cap them at 3%. And they kept on harping on about the interest rates. And I was like, and I kept on wondering, why are you going on about this? And it's actually when I studied for my video essay of the differences between the middle class and working classes, and looking into that, I've actually realized that a report by the government at the end of 2021, like the financial year of 2021, there are the third of the population actually have mortgages, and they actually have mortgages that are much like what you're saying. You said that it's kind of a bit of a debt trap where you're watching the dollars, you're watching the cents, and the difference between 2.5% and 3% could be the difference between you being able to pay the recent installment of your mortgage and you not. So that kind of clicked to me that even back in 1905, when um, Upton Sinclair is riding the jungle, and you have these working class families that are watching their dollars, because if they don't work that 12 to 14-hour shift where they get that extra dollar, could be the difference between them keeping their house and not. And we're here in 2022, and a conservative party is able to appeal to their voter base by saying, we'll cap the interest rates to 3%, even though they actually can't do that because that's the Reserve Bank of Australia. But that's beside the point. If they're able to appease their voter base by saying, we'll do something about the interest rates, then that lets you know that there's a problem with that. And really, as a middle class person that has a mortgage, maybe you don't really have that much, there's not much difference between you and the working class person back in 1905.
There it is. There it is. If your defining characteristic is your wage that allows you to subsist, and whether that subsistence is, like living from meal to meal or mortgage repayment to mortgage repayment, it doesn't matter. Those are the things that define what controls you. And if it's, and if your subsistence is earned through you selling your labor time your skill or your effort to somebody else for a price, then, call it what you want. You can call it whatever what makes you feel better or helps you sleep at night. But there are only two classes out there. They're the ones that are in control of the economy, and then those who work for a living. That's it. Got to get rid of the myths out there. We'll start busting some myths for us. That's what we're here to do, mate.
Promote the class consciousness. That's what we're all about here.
The class consciousness.
Solidarity.
I honestly think that's half the battle. Like, really. Like, once people are conscious, of their surrounds, and they're conscious of what it is that defines them, and places them in the juxtaposition to the people that seemingly don't share their struggles, then they are going to start to ask some serious questions. And when they can't get suitable answers, they're going to get angry and they're going to demand change. So half the battle is reverting that class consciousness, something that we had, up until I'd say about 50 years ago. Something that we had quite well internationally, but it's been eroded, and I really think that the fanciful notion of the middle class has completely destroyed class consciousness.
Okay, I think we've had a comprehensive talk today, and I think we might bookend it there. Like usual, guys, you'll probably notice the image in the background. You'll probably notice that there's a man in the front that has a suit, and the various high-rise buildings in the background. The prompt for this is the middle class versus the working class. So you could probably see the prompt there. And I do have a collection of all of these synthwave arts. I might actually release them to my Facebook page, and I'll make sure to tag you, Mr. E, so you can have a look, because we've actually collected over all of these 10 episodes a very interesting collection of synthwave art. So we'll make sure to share that with you guys. And with that, we'll give it a wrap. So remember, guys, to keep thinking and keep learning. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Mr. E.
Thank you, 4IS. It's been a pleasure as always. And to all of you out there, please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.